So now we've looked at the different beliefs behind medieval disease, we're going to take a couple of videos to have a look at the various different ways these diseases were treated. And we've already looked at a few of them anyway. So if we go into here, we can look at the belief from God for diseases. So again, we just reiterate what we said in a couple of videos ago, that disease was seen as a punishment from God, and for this reason people were encouraged to pray. So this was the logical conclusion for that. Prayer would help with the punishment from God. They also believed that pilgrimages and holy shrines could cure illness. So this was seen as like once a step up from prayer. So a step up from prayer. So the more the disease begins to spread, or the more serious the disease, the higher up you go in the sort of chain of prayer and repentance for the punishment from God. And there was also things called flagellants, who were people who whipped themselves in public. So this was again another step up, another step up, okay, as in you go from the different levels. So these people would forcibly whip themselves in public to show God that they are sorry for their actions, okay, and these were particularly common during epidemics. So epidemics, and an epidemic is simply a high concentration of disease in a number of people. So, for example, an epidemic around the medieval period was the Black Death. So, the Black Death, something that we will come back to in a later video all about on its own. Astrology was also used to treat illness, like we talked about this in another video. Again, astrology is to do with the moon and stars and planets having reference to your health. So using stars plus planets to predict health. Now, I've mentioned these levels, so you can talk about the sort of levels of intensity in terms of religious ways of treating a disease. So you start with prayer. You start with prayer as a way to getting rid of diseases. You then begin by looking at pilgrimages and holy shrines. And then we get to the most violent and brutal form of repentance, which was the forcibly whipping yourself in public as a way to prove to God that you were sorry for your actions. So these are the three main levels. There were other ways in which they used their Christian beliefs to try and cure illnesses and diseases. However, these were the most popular, especially prayer. So, moving on to this, we're going to look at the sort of practices that were used around the four humours theory. Okay, so if we recall from an earlier video, the four humours theory is the idea that the body is made up of four fluids. Okay, and go back to an earlier video to find out and to learn about specific details with this theory. But the four fluids included blood. Blood was one of the four. And they also believed that too much of one fluid is what caused illnesses. So too much of one fluid caused disease. So the logical conclusion from this theory is that one might have too much blood inside them. So therefore they started a practice called bloodletting, which was simply the removal of blood from the body. Okay, there's also another practice of purging, which we'll talk about in a minute, but bloodletting was simply a treatment of removing blood from the body. Okay, so see if I've got a picture of bloodletting. So this is a picture here of bloodletting. This is what we would call a doctor that is, I can't draw on the picture. Anyway, a doctor literally creating incisions in the arm and removing blood. And obviously this sometimes led to deaths because some people would have too much blood removed. Because in some cases, people who had their blood removed through bloodletting and still had the disease or the illness, they weren't told that maybe bloodletting wasn't the right treatment for them. They were simply done again. So they ended up losing more blood and more blood until they died of blood loss and therefore didn't cure the disease in any way. Okay? So purging, I'll just use this arrow here. So purging was simply the practice of getting rid of fluids via excretion. So like we said here with the 4 fluids idea, bloodletting gets rid of one of the 4 fluids, but there's also 2 others, such as yellow bile and black bile. So what happens if you have an imbalance of these 2 in the body, or too much of one? Well, they believed that you could do something called purging, which is simply using laxatives or anything to help the purging process to get rid of these fluids from the body. Okay, then we'll have a look at one more way of treating diseases in this video, and this is through the miasma theory. So if we remember in earlier videos, miasma theory was the belief that diseases came from bad air. So diseases came from bad air. Okay. And this is a very popular theory. I said in an earlier video that it was a popular theory effectively till germ theory was introduced into the world. And so if you have miasma theory, if you believe miasma theory, then you must believe that to prevent sickness, you should clean the air, have less bad air in the world, okay? And a number of ways to do this. So, for example, physicians would carry oranges around with them to protect themselves from the bad air. So this would be protection from bad air. Okay. Another such way was, specifically during the Black Death, which I said we will talk about in a later video, was to use incense, and you would fill the room with smoke. And if the idea being, if the room was filled with smoke, then there'd be no room for there to be bad air in that room, and it would stop bad air bringing disease from inside this room. Okay, so that's really what the kind of ways in which you would solve problems of diseases if you took on board the idea of the miasma theory.